Imagine opening your eyes before the sun has even thought about rising, in a cold room where the air bites your skin as soon as the blank it leaves your body. Your instinct might be to lie there for a moment, to stretch, to gather your thoughts the way we do today. But in Dark Age Britain, that luxury did not exist for a peasant. The rhythm of your life wasn't yours to control. You rose when you were told, you slept when you were allowed, and every moment in between was shaped by the will of someone who didn't even know your name. A peasant didn't belong to himself, he belonged to the land, and by extension, to the lord who claimed ownership over everything within his borders. This was the very core of the feudal world, a system where your birth sealed your fate long before you uttered your first word. To be born a peasant in the Dark Ages meant stepping into a world where almost nothing you touched was truly yours, not the soil beneath your feet, not the hut you slept in, and not even the work of your own hands. The structure of society was brutally simple. At the top, a king who claimed divine authority, beneath him, nobles who controlled vast lands, and lower still, knights and minor lords who maintained order. At the very bottom sat you, the peasant, the one whose labor kept the entire hierarchy alive. Without you, nothing functioned. Yet you received none of the credit, none of the freedom, and none of the respect. You were essential, yet invisible. From the moment you could walk, your path was already carved. You would till the fields, plant the seeds, harvest the crops, mend the fences, and serve whichever lord ruled the land you happened to be born on. School was not an option. Education was not a concept. Literacy was so rare among peasants that most people went their entire lives without reading a single word. The church might teach you prayers, but that was the extent of your learning. The stories of the world came to you secondhand through wandering travelers, through the occasional priest, or through the assumptions and superstitions that filled the gaps in knowledge. Your universe was the village, and anything beyond it was as distant and unreal as a different planet. Even the simple act of movement was controlled. In many villages, a peasant could not travel beyond the boundaries of the lord's land without explicit permission. If you tried to leave, even for reasons like visiting family, trading goods, or seeking better opportunity, you were seen as property attempting to escape. Punishments for this were severe: fines you could never afford, public shaming, or even being hunted down and dragged back like stolen livestock. You belonged to the estate, and the estate belonged to the lord. Your freedom of movement, your ability to choose where to live, and your right to seek better conditions were all caged from birth. Even marriage was not entirely your choice. You might think love was a personal decision, but in the Dark Ages, your marriage was intertwined with labor obligations. Marrying someone from another village often required the approval of both lords, because it meant the shifting of workers and the redistribution of labor. Some peasants were even forced to pay special taxes simply for getting married. A life event that should have been joyous became just another transaction between you and the system that owned you. Your children, too, were not completely yours. If you were a serf, a common type of peasant bound to the land, your child automatically inherited your status. From the moment they were born, they were locked into the same fate, lifelong servitude. There was no hope of rising above it. Stories of peasants becoming knights or nobles are mostly legends. For the vast majority, social mobility was a fantasy. The son of a peasant became a peasant. The daughter of a peasant became a peasant's wife. Their futures were fixed, rigid, and painfully predictable. In truth, the only path that changed a peasant's life dramatically was death. The work expected from you wasn't simply hard, it was relentless, consuming nearly every waking hour of your life. The Lord reserved the best land for himself, and peasants were forced to work it first. Before tending to your own tiny strip of fields, you had to plow, sow, or harvest the Lord's crops. You repaired his fences, collected his firewood, dug his ditches, and maintained his roads. Only after these obligations were complete, often at the end of a grueling day, could you turn your attention to feeding your own family. This imbalance wasn't a bug in the system, it was the system. Your labor enriched the Lord, and the scraps left over were what you lived on, and the truth was harsh. You did all of this not out of choice, but out of fear, fear of punishment, fear of starvation, fear of losing what little you had. The Lord wielded enormous power. If he believed you were not working hard enough, he could fine you. If he claimed you owed more tax, you had no right to argue. If he accused you of disobedience, there was no court to turn to. Justice was not a process, it was the Lord's opinion. The system gave him absolute authority, and that meant your voice could easily be silenced. Whether you were innocent or guilty mattered far less than whether the Lord was displeased. The idea of owning land would have been laughable to a peasant. Land meant power, stability, wealth, and the ability to grow food without fear. But peasants worked land that was always at risk of being taken from them. The Lord could reassign plots, impose new taxes, or demand new obligations at any moment. A peasant might spend years tending a field, nurturing it, knowing every inch of it only to have it handed off to someone else without warning. There was no legal claim you could make. The field was not yours, the harvest was not yours, and in many ways, even your time was not yours. Time, in fact, might have been the most tightly controlled part of a peasant's life. Bells, from the church or manor house, marked the hours, and your day was dictated by them. When the bell rang for work, you worked. When it rang for worship, you attended. During harvest season, you worked from dawn until dusk, and sometimes even after, guided by the dim glow of torches or moonlight. Your life followed the demands of agriculture and the expectations of the Lord, not your own desires or needs. Personal time was nearly non-existent. In modern life, we often take for granted the idea of personal identity, the sense that you are your own person with dreams and ambitions. But for a peasant, identity was tied to labor. What did you do? You farmed. What would you be next year? A farmer. What about in 10 years? Still a farmer. The world outside your village castles, kingdoms, wars, politics barely brushed your life except when it brought trouble. Armies marching through meant destruction. Nobles fighting meant higher taxes. A new king meant new rules, but none of them changed your position. You were still a peasant, and you always would be. Even the weather held power over you. A noble might complain about rain ruining a hunting trip. For a peasant, rain could mean the difference between eating and famine. A harsh winter could destroy your food stores. A dry season could ruin your crops. Too much rain could flood your fields. Too little could wither them. Nature itself felt like another lord ruling your life, unpredictable, uncontrollable, and often cruel. Every day was a reminder that survival depended on forces far beyond your control. Religion, too, shaped your existence. The church taught that your role as a peasant was part of God's plan. Priests often reminded you that obedience, humility, and acceptance of hardship were holy virtues. You were encouraged to believe that suffering on earth would earn you a better place in the afterlife. In a world with no hope of social mobility, faith became the only escape, the only comfort in a life filled with burdens. Yet even the church demanded its share: tithes, labor, and unquestioning loyalty. A peasant served the Lord during the week and the church on Sundays. There was never a moment that truly belonged to you. Imagine knowing that your life's work might never be remembered, that generations of your family could live and die on the same land, doing the same work, facing the same struggles, and leave behind nothing more than a few worn stones in a forgotten churchyard. The world would change above you, kings would rise and fall, borders would shift, languages would evolve, but your life would remain the same. You were part of history, but your name would never appear in it. To a modern mind, the lack of freedom is almost unthinkable, but for peasants, this was normal. You didn't dream of traveling the world or learning a trade or becoming something different. You dreamed of a better harvest, a warm winter, a year without sickness, a lord who reduced taxes rather than raising them. Your dreams were grounded in survival, not ambition. In this world, hope was a fragile thing. A good harvest might give you a moment of comfort, but you always knew it could be taken away. A kind lord might ease your burdens, but another could replace him at any moment. The world was unstable, unpredictable, and deeply unfair. And yet, peasants endured. They woke up every morning, picked up their tools, and worked because they had no other choice. Their resilience was not a heroic tale of triumph. It was the quiet, unspoken survival that kept entire kingdoms functioning. To be a peasant in Dark Age Britain was to live a life defined by limitation. Limited freedom, limited choices, limited resources, limited recognition. Your existence served the needs of others. Your labor fed the powerful. Your obedience maintained order. You were the foundation of society, yet treated as disposable. Everything around you, the laws, the customs, the expectations, reinforced your place at the bottom. You were alive, but not truly living in the sense we understand today, and this was the reality for millions over centuries. A life where your value was measured in labor, where your identity was shaped by forces beyond your control, and where your only certainty was that you would remain what you were born into. It is only when you step into the shoes of a peasant, really imagine the weight of their world, that you understand just how heavy and unforgiving life was at the bottom of Dark Age Britain. Imagine stepping outside your tiny hut at the break of dawn, the cold earth still wet with night mist, and realizing that the home you just walked out of, the place meant to protect you, is almost as harsh as the world outside. In Dark Age Britain, a peasant's home offered little comfort, and sometimes even more danger than the wild fields beyond the village. These dwellings weren't built with care or craftsmanship, or even the idea that humans deserved shelter beyond the bare minimum. They were built because you needed somewhere to sleep, somewhere to store what little you owned, and somewhere to stay alive through the brutal winter. Anything more than that was a luxury only the wealthy could imagine. The typical peasant hut was small enough that you could walk from one end to the other in a handful of steps, one door barely tall enough to walk through without ducking, no windows, not because the builders forgot them, but because windows were a privilege. Glass was unimaginable for peasants, but even simple shutters cost time and wood. A hole in the wall would only let in wind, rain, cold, and thieves, so the walls remained sealed, trapping air, trapping smoke, and trapping the people inside. The walls were made of wattle and daub-woven sticks covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and whatever else could be scraped together. This mixture hardened into a crude but reliable wall, one that could withstand wind and keep out some of the rain. But the walls weren't smooth or well finished. They cracked over time, letting in drafts that sliced through the hut like icy knives in winter. Peasants patched these cracks with handfuls of mud or manure, pressing the mixture in with bare hands. It wasn't hygiene that mattered, it was survival. If manure kept the cold out, then manure was welcome. The floor was nothing more than compacted earth, dirt, hard, uneven, always slightly damp, and often crawling with insects. Straw was scattered across it, not for comfort, but to cover the cold ground and absorb animal waste. Chickens roamed freely indoors. Sometimes a pig slept near the door. In winter, a cow or two might be brought inside. not because there was space for them, but because their body heat was precious. Every living creature in that hut served a purpose. The roof was thatched bundles of straw or reeds layered thickly and tied down with ropes. When newly made, a thatched roof could be surprisingly good at keeping out rain. But peasants rarely had new thatch. Their roofs were often old, patched, sagging under the weight of moisture, and filled with birds, mice, and insects that crawled through the straw. If a storm hit, water would drip through, leaving cold droplets splashing onto your face at night. You didn't wake up angry, you woke up grateful it wasn't worse. And then there was the smoke. Inside the hut, in the center of the room, burned a small fire. This fire was the only source of heat, the only way to cook, the only light at night. But unlike modern fireplaces, there was no chimney, no vent, no hole in the ceiling where the smoke could escape. Instead, smoke filled the entire hut, curling around the rafters, drifting down into your lungs, stinging your eyes, coating your clothes, and settling on every surface. It was suffocating, but it was necessary. There was no alternative. Why no chimney? Because chimneys required construction skill and valuable materials. They also let out heat, which peasants needed to keep trapped inside. Smoke itself helped preserve the thatch, killing pests and hardening the roof fibers. But this meant peasants inhaled smoke for hours each day. Their eyes constantly watered, their lungs burned, and long-term breathing issues were common, though no one called it that at the time. Illness was just life. When you walked into a peasant hut, your vision would blur instantly. The smoke hovered waist high, sometimes rising, sometimes sinking depending on the weather. Children learned to crawl not just because they were young, but because the air closer to the ground was clearer. Adults bent low when they entered, not just because the doorway was small, but because standing upright meant breathing smoke thick enough to choke on. You might think someone would open the door or create a vent to let the smoke escape. But opening the door meant letting in the cold, and in winter the cold could kill. Even a slight draft could chill a newborn or an elderly family member to death. So the smoke remained, swirling, burning, but keeping the home warm enough to survive. The interior of the hut was dim even at midday. With no windows and a single fire for light, everything glowed a dull orange. Shadows stretched across the walls. Tools, baskets, and clay pots lined the edges of the hut, stacked carefully because space was precious. If a family had a table, it was small more of a plank balanced on stumps than proper furniture. Most peasants ate sitting on the floor or on low stools carved crudely from logs. Sleeping arrangements were equally cramped. A family of 5, 7, or even 10 people might share the same space. Beds were not separate pieces of furniture, but rather piles of straw covered with old blankets or animal skins. Parents slept on one side, children beside them. Babies slept pressed between adults for warmth. Privacy didn't exist. Nighttime wasn't peaceful, it was noisy, crowded, and often restless. Snoring, coughing, animals shifting around, the crackle of the fire, the scratching of mice or rats behind the walls, this was the soundtrack of a peasant's night. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were constant companions. They lived in the straw bedding, in clothing, in the animal's fur, and even in the thatched roof. A peasant couldn't escape them. Even the wealthiest nobles dealt with parasites, but peasants lived in an environment where infestations were simply part of daily life. You didn't complain about fleas, you scratched and moved on. Illnesses caused by parasites were common, but no one understood their source. People believed sickness came from bad air, evil spirits, or divine punishment, not the invisible creatures living in their own bedding. The hut also smelled intensely. The scent was a mix of smoke, animals, damp earth, sweat, rotting straw, and the faint sour smell of stored grain. Toilets didn't exist inside the home. Peasants used pits dug in the ground outside. But children, animals, and even sick adults sometimes soiled themselves indoors. The smell was not shocking to them. It was normal. A peasant's nose adjusted to odors that would overwhelm a modern person. Storage inside the hut was painfully limited. Food was kept in woven baskets or hanging bags to protect it from mice, though rodents often found their way to it anyway. Meat, when available, was smoked not for flavor, but because it was the only method to keep it from rotting. Grains were stored in clay jars or sacks, but mold could ruin them, and insects often burrowed inside. A year of food could be destroyed overnight by rats or dampness, and if that happened, there was no safety net. Hunger would arrive quickly. Tools hung from the walls, simple ones like wooden rakes, basic hoes, or knives for cutting bread and slaughtering chickens. Anything metal was treasured. Iron was expensive, and peasants handled iron blades with care bordering on reverence. A broken tool wasn't an inconvenience, it was a disaster. The interior also served as a workshop. Women spun wool or linen in one corner, children helping or playing with scraps of fabric. Men repaired tools, wove baskets, or tied ropes. Everything was done by hand, by firelight, bent over low stools, or sitting on the floor. Evenings were filled with the constant motion of work, because rest was a luxury no one could afford. And then there were the animals, not outside in barns, but inside the hut. In winter especially, animals slept next to the family. A cow's warm body could raise the temperature of the hut drastically. Chickens laid eggs in corners, sometimes even on the straw bed, if not watched closely. Pigs, though smelly and stubborn, produced heat like living radiators. But with animals came mess, noise, and danger. A frightened cow could trample a child. A pig could bite. Chickens left droppings everywhere. But still, they were allowed inside because warmth was more important than cleanliness. Rainstorms and winds battered the hut constantly. The walls shuddered as if ready to collapse, and sometimes they did. A strong storm could rip off the thatch, leaving the family exposed. Rebuilding the roof took time and materials, both of which peasants rarely had. So many huts simply leaked for years, families living beneath bowls and cloths laid out to catch water. Rodents ran through the thatch, birds nested inside it, insects crawled in constantly. There was no such thing as a clean home in the modern sense. Dirt was the default state. Cleanliness wasn't achievable, nor was it expected. Despite all of this, the hut was the center of a peasant's world. It was small, fragile, smoky, dirty, cramped, and uncomfortable, but it was home. It was where meals were shared, where stories were told, where children grew, and where generations lived and died. But for all its emotional significance, the physical experience of living in a peasant hut was harsh beyond modern imagination. A place meant to offer shelter instead delivered smoke, filled air, disease, spreading parasites, unpredictable warmth, and only the bare minimum needed to keep a family alive. It was not a refuge from hardship. It was the hardship. From the moment a peasant opened their eyes in Dark Age Britain, their body already knew what the day demanded. There was no gentle waking, no time to stretch lazily or ease into the morning. Your bones ached even before you stood, and the cold reminded you that whatever warmth you had during the night was borrowed, temporary, slipping away the second you pushed aside the rough blanket. Work called before you could even breathe properly, and you felt its weight before your feet touched the dirt floor. In a world without machines, without modern tools, without relief, the body of a peasant was the engine that kept the entire system alive. And that engine had to run every single day without pause. The day began well before sunrise. The darkness outside wasn't peaceful. It was a reminder that you were already racing against time. In the winter months, you might only have a few hours of daylight to accomplish all the tasks the Lord expected from you. In the summer, daylight stretched long, but so did the demands placed on your back, hands, and legs. You stepped into that early morning cold, perhaps eating a piece of hard bread or barley mash, and headed out to the fields. There was no breakfast as we understand it, no warm drink to start the morning, no moment of silence. You moved because the alternative was punishment or worse, because falling behind meant your own family might starve later. Your first priority every day wasn't your own land or your own family's needs. It was the Lord's fields. Everything you grew for him always came first. Before tending your own tiny strip of farmland, you had to plow his soil, sow his seeds, harvest his crops, and carry his grain. And there was a constant pressure behind it all, the threat of being labeled lazy, unproductive, or disobedient. Even if you felt sick, even if your body screamed in pain, you went to work. There was no sick leave. Being ill didn't excuse you, it just made the work harder to complete. Much of the work required brute strength. Plowing meant guiding a heavy wooden plow pulled by an ox. The plow wasn't a sleek tool, it was a rough, often splintering piece of wood that fought against the earth, and you had to force it downward with your full weight. The ox didn't move smoothly, often stopping to chew or wander, and each time it did, you had to coax it forward. Your boots sank into the mud, your hands blistered from holding the handles, your breath fogged the cold morning air as you pushed and pulled, hour after hour. If it was sowing season, you walked the furrows with a bag of seeds slung across your shoulder, scattering them evenly with practiced sweeps. It wasn't as simple as throwing handfuls to the ground. You needed precision. Seeds were precious, and planting them too close or too far apart meant wasted food months later. You repeated the same motion hundreds of times, back and forth through the field, watching the wind, watching the soil, making sure nothing was lost. Harvest season was the worst. A peasant's body lived in dread of this time. Every able person, men, women, and even children, went to the fields with sickles, bending their backs hour after hour to cut down wheat or barley stalks. The sun was unforgiving in the humid late summer air, but you kept working, your back throbbing, your hands raw, your legs trembling. You couldn't stand for long because the job required constant bending. You couldn't sit because there was no time. The crop had to come down before the weather shifted, before rain destroyed everything. The Lord didn't care if your arms grew numb or if your fingernails tore from gripping the stalks. The harvest had to be done. After cutting the grain, it had to be bundled, carried, threshed, winnowed, and stored all by hand. Threshing meant beating the harvested grain with a flail, a wooden tool swung downward over and over to loosen the edible kernels from the stalks. The repetitive motion bruised your shoulders and strained your back. Then winnowing meant tossing the grain into the air so the chaff would blow away, leaving heavier kernels behind. The wind decided whether your work succeeded or failed. If the breeze was too weak or too strong, you had to repeat it again and again. Farming in the Dark Ages required a constant partnership with nature, but nature rarely cooperated. Beyond field labor, there were endless secondary tasks. You repaired fences that protected the Lord's animals and fields. You cleared stones and debris from pathways. You dug drainage ditches to prevent flooding. You carted firewood from the forest, hauling logs heavier than anything you could comfortably carry. You mended tools, sharpened blades on rough stones, and fetched water from a stream far from the village, carrying heavy pails that cut into your palms. This wasn't specialized work. It was everything that needed to be done, and there was always something more. If something broke, you fixed it. If the Lord needed extra hands for a project, you were summoned. If a storm came through, you worked twice as hard the next day to repair the damage. There was no season of rest. Winter, contrary to what some might imagine, was not a time to relax. Winter meant collecting firewood, tending animals, spinning wool, repairing thatch roofs, and doing the work that weather permitted, because neglecting it meant freezing, starving, or losing your home. And all of this came before you even touched your own land, your own survival. Only after completing the Lord's obligations could you turn toward the small patch of soil that helped feed your family. If you worked too slowly on the Lord's land, you risked punishment. If you worked too quickly, you risked making mistakes that could also get you punished. It was a narrow path, and walking it consumed you. By the time you arrived at your own fields, the sun might already be sinking. You worked until dusk, perhaps even by moonlight, because you could not afford failure. Your crops were your lifeline. Your grain, your vegetables, your tiny garden of onions or beans, these were the only things standing between your family and hunger. Even after days when your arms felt like lead and your knees felt ready to collapse, you pushed yourself further. If you stopped, someone at home would feel it. When winter arrived, women's labor was just as demanding, just as constant. Women worked in the fields alongside men, but their responsibilities extended further. They tended the hut, cooked, fetched water, gathered herbs, managed the children, spun wool into yarn, wove cloth, salted or dried meat, if any was available, baked bread, kept the fire alive, and mended clothing. They didn't rest either. A peasant woman worked from the moment she woke to the moment she collapsed into sleep, often while pregnant or nursing a baby. There was no distinction between men's work and women's work. Everything mattered, everything was necessary, everything depended on hands that never had a chance to heal. Children weren't shielded from labor. As soon as they were physically able, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, they took part. They scared birds away from crops, gathered eggs, collected firewood, carried small bundles of grain, fetched water, or helped care for animals. Childhood was not a time for play. It was training for a lifetime of toil. Play, if it happened, was brief, simple, and often woven directly into chores. Children learned early that their family depended on every pair of hands working. In addition to daily tasks, peasants were often required to perform corvée labor, unpaid work demanded by the Lord throughout the year. This could include building roads, repairing bridges, maintaining fortified walls, or digging trenches. No matter how much work a peasant had in their own life, when the Lord called for labor, they came. Refusing wasn't an option. The feudal contract, though peasants never signed anything, was enforced through fear and tradition. The Lord provided protection and land to live on, and peasants provided labor. But the scale was never balanced. The demands were often crushing, and the protection the Lord provided was far from guaranteed. Holidays existed, but they weren't breaks in the modern sense. Religious feast days often meant attending church for hours, followed by communal tasks or obligations related to the celebration. And even on these days, animals still needed care, fires still needed tending, and children still needed to be fed. A holiday might lighten the workload slightly, but it was never a true rest. A peasant's body did not get rest unless it collapsed, and even then, rest often came with consequences. Despite all of this, peasants rarely complained. Complaining didn't change anything, it only made the work feel harder. Life taught them to endure silently, to survive through routine and repetition, to accept what couldn't be changed. There was no shift to clock out from, no end to the week. Life blurred from one day to the next in a rhythm set by the seasons and controlled by the Lord. The most painful truth of all was that after a lifetime of exhausting labor, peasants had little to show for it. Their bodies broke down early, their hands hardened and cracked, their backs bent. Many died young, worn out by decades of relentless work. And yet, The system continued because another generation stepped into the same pattern the moment they were old enough to stand. Work shaped every day, every season, every year. It shaped your hands, your walk, your posture, your breath. In many ways, it shaped your identity. You lived to work and you worked to survive. This was the reality of labor in Dark Age Britain, not heroic, not romantic, but exhausting, repetitive, and unending. A life defined by tasks that started before sunrise and often ended long after the sun disappeared. A life where your muscles never truly rested and where every day carried the weight of someone else's demands. It wasn't just hard work, it was life itself. Hunger was not just a fear for peasants in Dark Age Britain, it was a companion that walked beside them every day of their lives. To understand their world, you have to imagine living in a time where food wasn't just limited. It was unpredictable, unstable, and constantly under threat from forces no human could control. For modern people, hunger usually means you're late to a meal, or you skipped breakfast because you were busy. But for a peasant, hunger meant life brushing against death. Hunger meant watching your children's ribs show through their skin. Hunger meant praying for rain one year and praying for the rain to stop the next. Hunger meant hoping that the little bag of barley in your hut would last through winter, even though you knew, deep down, it probably wouldn't. The peasant diet was painfully simple. It wasn't crafted for flavor or variety. It was designed to keep a weak body functioning just enough to survive another day of hard labor. Bread made from coarse, dark grains was the heart of every meal. It was dense, heavy, and sometimes filled with bits of grit because it was ground between rough stone. Every bite literally wore down your teeth. Along with this came pottage, a thick stew-like mush of whatever vegetables were available: cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips. Meat was precious, not because it was valued, but because it was scarce. Imagine going an entire year, maybe two, without tasting a single piece of meat. Fish was more common, but only if you lived near rivers or coasts, and even then, it depended on permission from the Lord. Sugar didn't exist in a peasant's life. Fruits were seasonal luxuries. Spices were rare and expensive. Even salt, something we take for granted, was not always easy to obtain. This left peasants depending on what their land could produce, and their land didn't care if winter came early, if a storm ruined the wheat, or if disease swept through the crops. The peasant fought nature every year, and nature often won. In a world without modern farming tools, without pesticides, without irrigation systems, a harvest was like a gamble played with the lives of an entire village. One drought could turn fertile earth into dry dust. One flood could rot stored grain or drown the fields. Cold weather arriving too early could freeze crops before they matured. Extreme heat could kill seedlings before they had a chance to grow. The peasants had no control. They could only watch the sky and hope it didn't betray them. A single bad harvest didn't just cause inconvenience, it could trigger a chain of suffering that stretched for years. If the harvest was weak, families immediately rationed what little they had. Meals shrank. Bread was stretched with ground peas, beans, and sometimes even sawdust or sand to make it last. Children got smaller portions than adults, not because adults were favored, but because adults needed strength to work, to plow, to gather, to keep the household running. A peasant mother often went hungry so that her children could eat. A father often pretended he had eaten earlier so that his family wouldn't worry. Hunger disguised itself in 100 small sacrifices. But rationing only delayed the inevitable. Winter was brutal. The fields produced nothing, and the cold preserved nothing. Every day meant dipping into the precious stores, grain tied in cloth sacks, vegetables dried or buried underground, beans sealed away in pots. And every day, the amount left got smaller. Peasants marked the passing of winter not on a calendar, but on how quickly their food disappeared. The terrifying time came when they realized how many weeks were left before spring and how many spoonfuls of grain remained. Some families starved waiting for spring. Others survived but emerged weak, sickly, and unable to work the fields effectively when planting season arrived. That weakness often meant the next year's harvest also suffered. Hunger didn't just punish, it lingered. There were years when famine rolled across the countryside like a shadow. Famine didn't simply appear, it built slowly, like a storm gathering strength. First, the crops struggled. Then animals died or had to be slaughtered early. Then the weaker villagers began showing signs of malnutrition, thinning hair, swollen bellies, brittle skin. Then came the barter, tools traded for grain, clothing traded for a small sack of barley, a chicken traded for a few loaves of bread. You can imagine how desperate a man must be to trade away the cloak that keeps him warm, the cloak that might be the only thing stopping him from freezing to death. During famine, desperation drove people to food sources they normally avoided. They ate whatever the land offered: wild roots, bitter berries, moldy bread, even tree bark boiled into a paste. They harvested the last remaining seeds, knowing full well that if they ate their seed grain, the next year's planting would fail. But starvation doesn't respect future consequences. Starvation forces choices that destroy tomorrow in order to survive today. The village animals suffered too. Pigs, sheep, and goats were the lifeline of a household. They offered milk, wool, and eventually meat. But during famine, animals required feed that peasants could not spare. Many livestock died simply because they had nothing to eat. Some were slaughtered early, long before they grew to a useful size, because the calories gained from eating them became more valuable than the long-term benefit of keeping them alive. Every time a family killed a pig or goat before winter, it meant the household was stepping deeper into desperation. Famine also brought sickness. When people are malnourished, their immune systems weaken. Colds turn into deadly fevers, small cuts become infected, parasites spread faster, children are the first to fall ill, infants stop growing, stop crying, stop moving, parents watch helplessly, unable to offer more than a few drops of thin broth. The elderly suffer too. When there isn't enough food, families, unwillingly, painfully, give priority to the youngest and the strongest. Old people ate last and often the least. Many died quietly during the night. Their families mourned, but they also knew horribly that one less mouth meant one more day of survival for everyone else. Famine twisted morality. It forced people to confront impossible choices. In times of extreme hunger, villages turned inward. People who were normally generous or cooperative became guarded and distrustful. A neighbor who always shared bread in better years now locked his door tightly. A woman who once gave away leftover vegetables now hid her remaining turnips beneath her sleeping mat. Families that had lived side by side for generations suddenly viewed each other as competitors for the last scraps of food. Hunger turned community into survival instinct. Human warmth froze under the weight of need. Even in normal years, years without famine, peasants were never truly full. Their meals lacked the calories needed to sustain the hard labor they performed daily. Men plowing fields on a freezing morning often did so with nothing but a small piece of crusty bread in their stomachs. Women carrying water from a distant stream often did so after skipping breakfast entirely. Children helping gather firewood did so with aching stomachs. Hunger wasn't an exception to life. Hunger was woven into the rhythm of life itself. And there was another layer to the struggle: taxes and demands from the Lord. Even in a good harvest year, the Lord's share came first. The peasants didn't get to fill their own stores until the Lord's granaries were satisfied. This meant that even if a family produced enough food for themselves, they might still starve because they owed so much to the estate. A peasant could look at a pile of grain, the result of months of back-breaking labor, and know that most of it would be carried away before his family had even tasted it. Hunger was often man-made, not just nature-made. Then there were the unpredictable disasters: crop blight, fungus that destroyed barley, mold that turned wheat black, insect swarms that devoured entire fields in a matter of days. These weren't slow failures. They were sudden, devastating moments when peasants watched a year's worth of hope vanish. The earth that should have fed them betrayed them, and there was nothing they could do but gather what little remained and brace for a long, painful year of scarcity. Spring brought relief, but only a little. The first edible plants, nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, became life-saving ingredients. People ventured into the woods searching for anything edible. They dug up roots, collected herbs, and picked young leaves. These wild foods weren't luxuries. They were survival tools. The first time a family tasted something fresh after months of stale grain was almost spiritual. But spring could also be cruel. Early crops were fragile, and late frosts could kill them instantly. For peasants, hope was always cautious, always fragile. When autumn arrived, it brought both joy and dread. Joy because it was harvest, the moment that determined whether the village would live comfortably or suffer through another harsh winter. Dread because everyone understood how thin the margin was between enough and not enough. A good harvest didn't guarantee safety. It only improved the odds. Even in the best of years, the average peasant lived on the edge of hunger. Food storage itself was a challenge. Without modern preservation methods, grain could spoil from moisture, be eaten by mice or rats, or grow moldy in damp huts. A family might think they had enough food for winter, only to discover that half of it had turned bad. Peasants fought not just hunger, but rot, pests, and time. When famine grew severe, rumors spread of villages where people resorted to unthinkable acts. While rare, there were stories whispered in fear, stories of theft, of fights over scraps, and in the darkest times, of cannibalism. Whether all of these stories were true or exaggerated is unclear, but the fact that such rumors existed tells us how desperate people could become. But hunger didn't only attack the body, it attacked the mind. It drained joy, hope, energy, and emotion. A child who grew up hungry learned early that crying didn't bring more food. A mother who couldn't feed her baby felt a shame deeper than words. A father who returned from the fields empty-handed experienced a kind of hopelessness modern people rarely understand. Hunger made every decision harder, every conflict sharper, every day longer. It reshaped personalities. It aged people prematurely. It turned vibrant, strong, young individuals into thin, exhausted shadows of themselves. And yet, through all this suffering, peasants kept going. They didn't have the luxury of giving up. Their survival depended on endurance, physical, emotional, and communal. They shared what little they could. They supported neighbors when someone collapsed from weakness. They gathered food collectively. They sang songs during harvest to keep spirits alive. They prayed for good weather and thanked the land for whatever small blessings it offered. Hunger shaped Dark Age Britain more than war, politics, or kings. It forged the character of its people. It determined who lived and who died. It created cycles of hardship that lasted for generations. And in this long fight against hunger and famine, peasants stood on the front lines, armed with nothing but determination and the hope that maybe, just maybe, the next harvest would be better. Disease was not an occasional visitor in the life of a Dark Age peasant. It was a constant shadow that lingered in every home, every field, every water source, and every season. Sickness was woven into the rhythm of daily existence, like an unwelcome rhythm that never stopped beating. If hunger was the slow, gnawing enemy, disease was the unpredictable killer, sometimes silent, sometimes violent, always near. To live as a peasant in Dark Age Britain was to live in a world where the body was always under attack, and where even the simplest infection could mean the end of a family's story. Imagine waking up each morning on a straw mattress that has never been cleaned, surrounded by fleas, lice, and the stale smell of smoke that clings to everything you own. The hut you sleep in is cold and damp. Its walls leaden drafts, its floor is dirt, its roof leaks. This is the environment where disease grows quickly. Children cough in the night, babies cry with fevers you don't understand, an old man shivers uncontrollably in the corner, wrapped in a blanket full of holes. These scenes weren't moments of crisis, they were everyday life. The typical peasant had no concept of germs or bacteria. They had no understanding of how disease spread or how to avoid it. They believed illness was caused by bad air, evil spirits, curses, or the displeasure of God. So when someone fell ill, the family responded with a mix of fear, superstition, and helplessness. They prayed, they whispered old remedies, they panicked quietly, knowing deep inside that most illnesses were beyond their ability to cure. When sickness entered a household, it felt like a storm cloud settling over the whole family, a hovering threat that could take a child or an elder in the blink of an eye. The water peasants drank was often contaminated. Streams were shared with animals, waste soaked into the ground around homes, wells were shallow. Even in villages where people tried to keep water sources clean, nature had a way of ruining their efforts. Rain washed dirt, animal droppings, and dead plants into water supplies. A peasant dipped a bucket into a stream thinking only of thirst, unaware that invisible killers swam inside. Dysentery, violent diarrhea that caused dehydration, claimed countless lives. A single bad sip could send a child into days of agony. A strong adult might survive, but a weak or malnourished person often didn't. The absence of medical knowledge meant a wound, even a small one, was dangerous. A cut from a farming tool, a scrape from a wooden fence, or a burn from a cooking fire could easily become infected. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, infection spread quickly. Skin turned red, swollen, and hot. Pus formed, fever followed, body weakness set in. Families watched helplessly as a once healthy worker became bedridden, unable to move or eat. An infected wound could take a man who had worked the fields his entire life and kill him within a week. The tragedy wasn't rare, it was routine. Parasites were another enemy. Fleas infested animals and humans alike. Lice crawled through hair and clothing. Worms lived in the intestines of nearly every peasant. These parasites drained energy, caused constant itching, transmitted diseases, and made malnutrition even worse. Children suffered the most. Their bellies swelled not because they were well fed, but because worms consumed the nutrients their bodies desperately needed. Parents watched with frustration, unable to do anything except boil herbs or try old remedies passed down through generations. And then there were the sudden outbreaks, deadly illnesses that spread through entire villages. Smallpox, measles, influenza-like fevers, and mysterious plagues appeared without warning. When one person got sick, everyone in the cramped hut breathed the same air, slept side by side, and shared the same cups. The illness moved like fire through dry grass. A child coughed on his sister. The sister coughed on her mother. The mother carried the sickness to the fields. The fields carried it to the whole village. There was no concept of isolation, no idea of quarantine. People simply didn't understand how to stop disease. During outbreaks, you could walk through a village and hear the sound of coughing behind every thin wall. You could see pale, trembling figures leaning against fences for support. You could smell sickness in the air. Peasants tried everything they knew, herbs, poultices, whispered prayers, charms hung above beds, but most of it did nothing. The fear that spread alongside disease was overwhelming. Mothers slept sitting up, holding feverish infants. Fathers paced outside, torn between tending crops and staying by the bedside of a dying child. Grandparents whispered old prayers, pleading with gods or saints to spare one more life. Cold seasons made things even worse. Winter confined people indoors, increasing the spread of illness. The smoky air from indoor fires irritated lungs. Dampness soaked into every bone. Respiratory illnesses became deadly. A simple cold could turn into pneumonia. A fever could burn out of control because there was no medicine to bring it down. Peasants wrapped themselves in rough wool, but the cold always found a way through. And when sickness struck in winter, the weakened body, already starving and exhausted, had little chance to fight back. Children died at heartbreaking rates. In some villages, a family might lose 2 or 3 children before any reached adulthood. Mothers learned to expect loss, fathers grieved in silence, communities grew numb to the sound of wailing. A tiny grave behind a small church was a common sight. Parents named their babies after older siblings who had died young, repeating the same names with a mixture of hope and resignation. Childhood itself was fragile, like a candle struggling to stay lit in a windy world. Birth was another battlefield of disease. Women gave birth at home, on straw, surrounded by smoke and dirt. There were no doctors, only midwives with limited knowledge and experience. Infection during childbirth was extremely common. Many women died giving life. Many infants died minutes after being born. If a mother lived through childbirth, she often faced weeks of weakness, fever, and pain. Husbands watched helplessly, torn between caring for their wives and working the land. When a woman died in childbirth, it shattered the family, emotionally and practically. A husband suddenly faced raising children alone in a brutal world. Sometimes he remarried quickly, not out of desire, but out of necessity. Life allowed no pause for grief. And yet, as brutal as disease was, peasants had no choice but to push forward. The sick still had to work if they could. The weak still had to carry water and cut wood. Illness didn't mean rest. It meant forcing yourself through pain because there were no alternatives. If a man couldn't work, the fields suffered and the family went hungry. If a woman couldn't cook or clean or tend to children, the household collapsed. Illness had consequences far beyond the body. It threatened survival. Villages tried to care for their sick, but their knowledge was extremely limited. Healers used herbs, some helpful, some useless, some dangerous. They made teas from chamomile, mint, or willow bark. They applied poultices of mashed leaves and flowers. They chanted, prayed, or wore charms believed to hold protective power. These efforts brought comfort, but not cures. When illness ran wild, peasants understood that survival was a matter of luck as much as anything else. Fire was another silent danger. The hearth was the heart of the home. It cooked food, provided warmth, and dried wet clothes. But it also filled the hut with smoke, damaging lungs. Worse, it could spread to thatched roofs and dry wood. A spark could ignite an entire house in minutes. If a hut burned, the family lost everything: food, clothing, tools, bedding. In winter, losing a home often meant death. Villagers formed bucket lines, but their ability to fight fire was limited. A single house fire could spread to others, turning a peaceful village into a scene of panic and destruction. Accidents also threatened life. Farming was dangerous with heavy tools, animals that kicked, slippery fields, and unstable carts. Without medical care, a broken bone often healed crooked, or not at all. A crushed foot meant permanent disability. A deep cut meant infection. A fall from a horse could be fatal. Life demanded strength and endurance, but offered little protection. War and raids added more danger to life. Even if a peasant never held a weapon or entered a battlefield, war found them. Armies moving across the countryside stole food, burned fields, and spread disease. Raiders took livestock, kidnapped people, and destroyed homes. The aftermath of war was hunger, sickness, and fear. Peasants had no defense. They hid in forests, prayed in churches, or fled to nearby villages. but the chaos of war touched every corner of the land. Through all of this, death was a familiar presence, but peasants did not face it with constant despair. They adapted. They developed a kind of emotional resilience that allowed them to survive loss after loss. They mourned the dead, but life forced them to return to work quickly. They cared for their sick with love and desperation, but they accepted fate when no cure came. They believed suffering was part of the human condition, woven into the world by forces beyond their understanding. And yet, even in this world of sickness and danger, peasants showed remarkable strength. They helped neighbors when illness struck. They brought food to families who were too sick to cook. They prayed together, believing community made them stronger. Their survival depended not just on physical endurance, but on the bonds they shared. They understood that one day they would need help too, and so they gave it freely when they could. Disease and danger shaped the life of every peasant, defining how long they lived, how hard they worked, and how much they suffered. But these hardships also forged a kind of quiet heroism. The fact that peasants endured, generation after generation, is a testament to their courage. In a world where sickness was everywhere and safety was nowhere, they still built families, communities, and traditions. They found moments of joy, a warm fire, a good harvest, a healthy child, a quiet evening after a long day's work. They celebrated life even as death surrounded them. Their resilience kept Britain alive through centuries of turmoil. Their endurance laid the foundations for future generations. They lived in a world where one illness could end everything, yet they kept working, kept hoping, kept fighting. And though history rarely remembers their names, their daily struggle against disease and danger shaped the very world that came after them. If there is one thing that defined the life of a Dark Age peasant in Britain, one thing that hung over every day like a low, heavy cloud, it was the feeling that life simply was not their own. From the moment they woke up to the moment they dropped back into sleep, exhausted and aching, peasants lived inside a rigid structure that pressed down on them from every direction. The landowner who claimed their labor, the weather that controlled their survival, the church that monitored their behavior, and the constant threat of violence that lurked along the edges of their world. In the end, this part of the story, the legacy of being a peasant, is really a story about living in a world designed to keep you small, obedient, and afraid. For most peasants, their legacy was not measured in achievements or memories or personal stories. Their legacy was measured in land they did not own, in work that never ended, in hunger that returned each winter, in diseases that stalked every family, and in children who rarely survived long enough to grow old. Their names rarely appeared in any written record. Their lives were not the kind that scribes cared to preserve, and their existence was not the kind that kings or monks found important enough to record. And yet, they carried an entire society on their backs. Every harvest they brought in fed the swords, the crowns, and the church chalices that would never acknowledge them. The biggest tragedy is that peasants were always one silent mistake away from losing everything. Sometimes not even a mistake, just bad luck. A bad harvest could destroy years of back-breaking work. A sudden illness could wipe out half a family before anyone knew what was happening. A lord demanding more labor could push surviving children into exhaustion, and war, always unpredictable, always cruel, could sweep through and burn away the only home a family had known for generations. To be a peasant in Dark Age Britain was to live with the constant shadow of uncertainty, knowing that tomorrow you might wake up with less food, less strength, fewer family members, and fewer options. But the harshest part of all was that peasants were never really permitted to dream. They could imagine a better harvest, or a kinder lord, or a winter that wasn't quite so bitter, but dreams of freedom. Dreams of rising above their status, dreams of choosing a life different from the one they were born into. Those dreams were not allowed to take shape. In fact, most people never even thought of them. The idea of rising above your station, a concept modern society takes for granted, did not exist for peasants in the Dark Ages. Social mobility was almost non-existent. You were born a peasant, you lived as a peasant, and you died a peasant. And your children, no matter how bright, how hardworking, how skilled, would inherit the same fate simply because they were your children. This inevitability created a sense of quiet resignation that defined peasant life for centuries. It wasn't the fiery misery of open rebellion or constant outrage. It was the softer, heavier misery of knowing that no matter how hard you worked, your life was already written. There were no opportunities to climb, no ladders to grab, no paths to walk except the one beaten dirt road generations of your family had already walked. Many peasants didn't even consider the possibility of upward movement because the world around them had trained them not to think that way. The Lord was above them, the church was above the Lord, God was above everything, and they were at the bottom where they belonged. But even in the bottom place, there were struggles constant enough to define an entire culture. Hunger remained a lifelong companion. Most peasants lived one poor harvest away from famine. Bread, which should have been a humble comfort, was often the center of conflict, scarcity, and fear. There were years when peasants ate bread made of crushed beans, peas, or even ground bark mixed with flour because real grain was too precious to waste. There were years when parents deliberately tightened their belts so their children could eat a little more. There were times when peasants boiled weeds into soups just to keep their stomachs from twisting in on themselves. And then there were winters, long, dark, merciless winters that swallowed the sun early in the afternoon and did not let go of the cold. Peasants huddled together in smoky, cramped huts, the air heavy with the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and fear that the food running low might not last till spring. Cold was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. It killed babies in their sleep, it froze the weak, it made sickness spread faster, and it made time stretch in a cruel way, because every winter night felt longer than the last. Even when the weather was kinder, life still demanded unhuman levels of labor. The peasant's daily schedule was a loop carved by necessity. Wake up before dawn, stumble into the fields, break the soil, haul water, gather firewood, tend livestock, repair tools, help neighbors when forced, pay rents, obey orders, kneel in church, walk miles to grind grain, carry loads that bent the spine, and return home long after sunset with barely enough energy to chew the food they had cooked. There were no days off. There were no rest periods. There were no paid breaks. Season after season passed in a blur of work that never eased its grip. And that work was not even fully theirs. Everything a peasant did, every seed planted, every row plowed, every vegetable harvested, was ultimately for someone else. A portion belonged to the landowner. Another portion went to the church. Another portion was withheld in case the Lord demanded more, or war came, or there was a tax suddenly raised. Only after everyone else took their share could a peasant look at what remained and try to feed a family. This created a world where relief was rare. Celebrations existed, feasts, festivals, harvest gatherings, but even those moments were clouded by the knowledge that tomorrow the same brutal routine would begin again. Joy existed, but it flickered like a candle struggling in a drafty hut. You held onto it while you could, knowing it would not last, but even with all of this, hunger, overwork, fear, peasants still endured something deeper, the constant awareness that they had no protection. Lords protected land, not people. Kings protected borders, not individual families. The church protected souls, not bodies. In the Dark Ages, danger could appear suddenly as a raiding party, a band of thieves, or even another lord's soldiers demanding food or shelter. Peasants often ran to hide in forests, hoping the trees would shield them from the violence sweeping through their villages. Some dug pits to bury their valuables. Some had nothing to hide at all. After raids, peasants returned to burned crops, trampled fields, stolen livestock, and broken families. It took years to recover from a single attacks. Sometimes they never truly recovered at all. The land did not rest long enough. Hunger deepened. Children who might have survived a normal year died in brutal ones, and yet peasants rebuilt because the alternative was simply to lie down and die. They rebuilt because there was no other path. And they rebuilt because even after generations of suffering, they still believed next year might be kinder. But perhaps the most haunting part of the peasant legacy was how invisible peasants were. Their lives were not documented. Their struggles were not recorded in detail. Their deaths were rarely marked with a stone. They passed through the world quietly, leaving behind nothing but the work of their hands. It was only centuries later that historians pieced together their lives through fragments, bits of pottery, abandoned cottages, charred wood, and rare mentions in monastery records. The silence surrounding them in the historical record mirrors the silence that surrounded them in life. They were seen only when their labor was needed. They were heard only when their voices rose in prayer or in pain. Even so, peasants left behind something powerful: resilience. Despite every obstacle, they created families, preserved traditions, raised children, loved deeply, grieved openly, and built communities strong enough to survive in a world that constantly tried to break them. The stories we reconstruct today, the small joys, the rituals, the songs, the folktales, the surviving artifacts, all show a people who refused to be defined solely by suffering. They found meaning in the rhythm of the seasons, comfort in the company of neighbors, and purpose in keeping their families alive for another year. Their patience, their endurance, their grit, these traits held Britain together through some of the darkest centuries in its history. Kings might have worn crowns, but it was peasants who fed the kingdom. Lords might have owned the land, but it was peasants who shaped every field. The church might have guided the beliefs of the people, but it was peasants who filled its pews and kept its monasteries supplied. Every stone in every medieval village, every road, every field, and every tradition that survived into the modern world carries the imprint of their labor. Yet they rarely received credit. Their names faded. Their stories vanished. Their tombs were unmarked. But the impact of their existence is everywhere, woven into the very landscape of Britain. So why did it suck to be a peasant in Dark Age Britain? Because the world expected them to carry the weight of society without giving them dignity, protection, opportunity, or rest. Because they worked harder than anyone else and gained the least. Because they lived in a world stacked against them from birth. Because the hunger that gnawed at them was never fully satisfied. The fear that haunted them never fully faded. And the freedom they longed for was never within reach. And because their lives, though full of labor, hardship, and quiet resilience, were rarely acknowledged by the very people who depended on them most. But their legacy is not just about misery. Their legacy is about survival. They endured centuries of difficulty, and still they held their families together, passed on their traditions, and made life possible for every class above them. Their contributions shaped the Britain that would rise from the Dark Ages into the medieval world and beyond. They were the foundation upon which the entire structure of society stood. The tragedy is that they never lived long enough or free enough to see the fruits of their own endurance. But the truth is simple. The quiet strength of Dark Age peasants is one of the greatest, least recognized forces in British history. Their story is not written in chronicles or royal records. It is written in the survival of a nation that would not have existed without them.